Everyone, welcome. Here we are at CAWTAC meeting number 21. I hope you all enjoyed a little extra time between last meeting and this meeting. We had an extra week, a little more time to digest the materials and gear up for this meeting. So at the last time we met, we were talking about buildable land inventory constraints inside the UGB and unsuitable land outside the UGB in UGB study areas. And then we also talked a little bit about land use efficiency measures. Today, we're focusing more on just one topic, urban reserve areas, and breaking that conversation down into two parts. Off the top, thanks so much, everyone, for being so active on the mural board. And for those who haven't taken a glance at that, you might want to take a look and see all the notes that folks have been sharing. That's been really helpful in a number of ways. I mean, just that way for people to let us know ahead of time what they're thinking. It helps us with our clarifying questions as well. Karen is going to, answer some of those questions in the presentation, and then we'll address some of them in the conversation. The clarifying questions portion, we'll still ask for clarifying questions, and then potentially later after the poll. But we do, part of this was we do want to keep that clarifying questions portion of our conversation as concise as possible and keep it to just questions. So if you do have maybe longer questions or comments disguised as clarifying questions, maybe hold those until after the poll, and we'll dig in deeper during the conversation. With that, I believe Jenna is going to lead us today to introduce our focus area and questions from the racial equity framework. Jenna.
Yeah, thanks. And hi, everyone. Good to see you all. So for today's racial equity focus framework focus area, we're bringing it back to one that we haven't talked about in a little while, which is benefits and burdens. And in particular, we'll be looking at benefits and burdens when considering the approach for designating urban reserves, which is the focus of today's conversation. And the key questions for consideration under this focus area are, one, what are the benefits and burdens, including from a financial, environmental, and social aspect of the proposed approach? And this could include how certain areas are prioritized over others and ultimately designated as urban reserve areas. The second key question for consideration involves identifying possible unintended consequences of the proposed approach for urban reserve areas and which areas may be considered cost prohibitive. How could these potential consequences be mitigated? And Cotton will go into more detail on this topic during the presentation, but you'll notice in the memo, there is a provision to allow land to be given lower priority if providing urban services is not reasonable or cost effective. So as we get into that discussion, I would like us all to think about whether there may be any equity concerns or other unintended consequences that should be mitigated, and if so, how. So that's all I have for now, and I will pass it back to you, Steve.
All right. Well, again, jumping into urban reserves and the prioritization of land, I'm just going to immediately hand it over to Karen.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We are officially in rodeo season, and I bring that up for two reasons. One, if you haven't got your tickets to the St. Paul Rodeo, they're almost gone. And my new favorite is the Juneteenth 8-second rodeo at the Memorial Coliseum. And those tickets, there's like 10 left. So y'all get your rodeo tickets because it's season. So little known fact, my family ranched quite a while in the Ozarks in the southern part of the country. And so many a rodeo and livestock auction I have been to. But I realized with legislative rulemaking, this is definitely my first rodeo. And we're going to see if I get that stay on 8 seconds or if I get bucked off real soon, because I think today we're going to have some real robust conversation. So looking forward to that with all of you. The sun is out and we will dig into it. I did not prepare a lot of slides for you today because I think we have a lot of topic and discussion time available, but I did want to highlight a few things. So what we have here, I think starting off with our next slide, is some of the statutes and legislative authority that we drew on as we were looking and thinking about these rules. And so I'll direct you to statute in 197A around 232, subsection 1. This statute really digs into the purpose and the outcomes of the long-range planning. So I took just an excerpt out of it, that it allows for local government to provide greater certainty for the agricultural and forest industries. It provides some long-term protection for large blocks of land through the reserve process. It also allows commerce and other industries and other private landowners to really think about public services and where those might be planned for, where the locations are more likely and less likely. And as we get more granular and defined, there's greater certainty, and it adds some additional clarity. In addition, I wanted to note that our statutes that give us this the statutes that give us the authority to work on these rules are also guided by our statewide land use planning goals. And you'll see that precedence in rule as well. So division 21, section 30, subsection 2, you'll see that it refers to the goal 14 factors. And I pulled out a couple of those factors that in urbanization processes, we're always looking at the comparative analysis of that environmental, economic, and social consequences, or the SE factors in there. And we're looking at, as we urbanize, what is the compatibility of these urban uses with the nearby agriculture and forest lands. So it's always a balancing act of protecting our most highly capable and productive resource lands, whether that's timber and forest lands or agricultural and farming lands, with the need to have efficient urbanization. So I thought I would just ground us in that. And then I think in the next slide, we have kind of one of the more significant parts of the draft rules that you all received last week. And I'm going to do this in two ways. I'm going to do it kind of here in a chronological, and then I'll do it in the next slide, kind of a visual approach of what does that prioritization look like? What does it really mean? So I think for most of us, it's pretty familiar. It's existed in rule for a while that exception and non-resource lands are our highest priority to be brought in as urbanizable land or considered for long-term planning for urbanizable land. Second, there's a few areas in the state. Marginal lands are not very widespread, but there's some select areas. Those would be second priority. And then third through fourth priority, we've kind of parsed this out a bit. So high value forest lands under statute 195-300, that's a pretty broad categorization of high value farmland. And then we get to more of a refined, some of the highest or the best farmland is delineated even further with a finer grain filter, if you will, under statute 215-710-1. So that's some of the highest value. And then lastly, when you take any of your farm or high value farmland, there's a soil classification system and then a slightly comparable or slightly different classification system for forest lands. And you'll see that classification system really pulls out where are those prime and unique soils. And so in the next slide, I'll just depict what that looks like in the rules that we're proposing, that we start up really high with that first high priority category, and then we get into farmlands and we get more granular, we get more narrow, and we really filter out, well, you can't add all farmland. Okay, you can add some, but not the highest, most productive farmland. Okay, you can add that farmland, but really limit the prime and unique soils and get the least capable or the least productive lands to go in first. And so that's what a lot of the rule amendments that we're proposing are, finding that consistency between the statutes that I shared out front, our statewide land use planning goal 14 and goal 3, and then bringing that into rules. And so with this last slide here, I think what I want to point out is one of the goals of our rulemaking process was to add additional clarity and certainty, but also really align it. I think within our charter, the commission's directive to us was to really look at the rules to create more efficiencies or facilitate the use of these tools, but to always make sure that they were aligned with the protection of our resource lands. And so we've done that by adding this additional information and clarity where we could, and then looking at some pragmatic ways that cities could look at differentiating what might be more easily developed and what lands have additional barriers or challenges within that classification system. And so what we tried to accomplish was, within the priority 1 classification, we understand that if land is very parcelized and it shows a pattern of residential development, like a subdivision, could we have a tiering within that classification? That maybe not all exception lands are equal. Those that present subdivisions or planned unit developments, that they might have a lesser capacity for residential development than other land where it doesn't have present that development pattern, but that it would stay within that classification system. I think in addition to that, we realize that not all rural land or not all urbanizable land can be serviced in the same way. And so how do we allow for that cost or the barriers to urban services to also play a role in how lands are prioritized? And so you'll see that new addition as well. All right, so I think what I want to do at this point is I'm going to actually go to the Miro board. And I think if we take down the slides, let's see. I think if everybody wants to follow along on the Miro board, let us know if that doesn't work and we can adjust. We'll be flexible and maybe we'll share screen and go through the Miro board together. But if everybody wants to hop in there, I'm going to start in the upper left-hand corner. And I've selected clarifying questions.
Sorry, Karen, could you drop the link in the chat for people who
that's
don't have it readily handy? Thank you.
See.
Or someone drop it in.
Yeah, if someone could drop that in. See where we're at.
I can look for it. I might beat you to it.
I think I beat you to it. So let me know if folks are able to get in there, if you're able to navigate around. If you're not, we can do a share screen and get everybody looking at the same. But I'm going to start in the upper left-hand corner, and you're going to watch me. I had meant to freeze or lock everything, but I can't figure out how to do that right now. I was going to lock it during our meeting and then unlock it right after our meeting. But let's just all promise not to delete anything, not to move stuff around. I'm going to start checking off what I've addressed. You'll hear me. Oh, all right. Maybe I should have locked it. Somebody just added a column. It's okay. Let's see if I think I can delete that column. Delete. Oh dear. That's not what I wanted to do. I just lost everything. All right, hold on. Let's pause here. I should have. Okay, we're not going to delete that column. It's added. It's going to stay there. Here we go. So our first one up in the left-hand corner, Al, thank you for bringing that up to us. It looks like what we have is an existing statute that requires at least 20 years for an urban reserve area. And then we have a rule that has a minimum of 10 years. So that minimum in the rule and the statute do not align. I think that is an oversight or a typo. So Al, we will address that in version 2. And we will amend the rule to align with the statute. All right, so that I'm going to do this with that one, and that's how we'll move through a few of them. Let's see. So agricultural trusts and easements, how are those treated? Oh boy, what is going on with you guys?
I think we maybe should switch to the share screen.
All right, let's do that.
Looks like a bunch of bees buzzing around. I'm gonna leave it.
Okay, let's do this. How's that, folks? We'll drive you through it. Is everybody seeing that okay?
Got it.
All right. What happened here? Okay, so this is the one we're on. Agricultural trust easements. So I've talked with staff here at DLCD, and it sounds like there is precedence. I can't remember which one it was. Maybe it was McMinnville, and Kevin helped me out if I'm mistaken. There is precedence. Does that sound right? Precedence from the department that you discount the capacity for lands within your UGB that have agricultural easements. We don't see any reason why we couldn't extrapolate that to urban reserves, but I see the comment here that it's not addressed in rule. So should we explicitly say in rule that there's an opportunity to discount the capacity of agricultural trust easements? So noted for a clarifying piece that's not addressed in rule, noted that there's precedence for addressing that within the UGB. And so I'm going to take that one as a clarifying question. And if there's something we missed on that question, we'll come back to it in discussion. This one, I was hoping to have the author, if the author would please step forward and give us a little bit more here. I'm going to give some clarifying, what I think is some responsive things that have come up. We know that between Division 21 and Division 24, there's language around looking at a study area analysis for a UGB amendment within half a mile or a mile, depending on the size of the city. And then when you're looking at urban reserves, it asks you to look at land nearby and adjacent to your UGB for reserve land that might be established congruent or abutting your UGB. And so the discrepancy between nearby and the specificity of a half mile or a mile between those two divisions are language that could be synced up. We also believe that there's a reason for the language not being, the different language has very specific reasons behind that. But I wanted to ask the author of this note, if I'm getting at what they are referring to, or if there's something else we're missing here. So.
Yeah, that was me. I think that that was indicated as a takeaway in the memo of trying to sync up language between urban growth boundary and urban reserves rules. And I think the way that we think about urban reserves, I have a couple of specific examples. We use developable versus buildable, and I'm trying to remember what else. I don't have those notes in front of me right now because my screen just went blank, so that's always exciting. But I think it was just more of like a general comment that was identified as a takeaway in the memo. I'm hoping that when we have all of the sections put together at the end, where we can really kind of go through how urban reserves flows into UGB expansion, that it will make sense. Because I think that I agree that there are reasons for the language to be a little bit different because you're doing higher level analysis at urban reserves and then more refined analysis of a smaller area at expansion. But we just want to make sure that it's seamless might be too optimistic. But yeah, so it's just more of a general note that as we're going through this, looking for those opportunities, which I think you're doing, but yeah.
And that reminds me of one additional opportunity. Thank you. First, thank you for clarifying the note and then knowing that there's kind of an iterative process of bringing the two divisions. So yes, you will see the rules for those together. But it brings up another point. In the memo, it mentioned we got feedback last year that at least some jurisdictions that have experience doing an urban reserve and getting that adopted and acknowledged, and then going to amend their UGB, that there might be some redundancy in the analysis done. So we did our analysis for the reserve area and we ruled out some lands. Then we did our analysis to bring in reserves into our UG, but we had to do this mile radius and we had to look at lands that we'd already ruled out. Kevin, I'm gonna invite you to help me with this one, but I believe there's some precedents that the state allows for the utilization of previous analysis. So if you've ruled out lands that you did not select for an urban reserve area for whatever reasons, you can bring that into your analysis for your UGB. And I believe the precedence is Metro. We have allowed Metro to amend the UGB only looking at their reserve land, and that would be allowed for other cities as well. I think if your reserves don't satisfy the need, then it might be a little bit different, Kevin, of what you're asking cities to look at.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Karen. That if you adopt ample urban reserve areas, when a city is looking to expand UGB, you need go no further than looking at urban reserve areas. There's no need to go through the additional prioritization. So that's available to any city or to Metro through the program.
And then I see a hand. Martha, are you going to tag on to our discussion here about syncing up language? Come on in.
I was happy to see that. Thank you, Heather. I had that thought also when I was reading this memo and I opened up Division 24, 660 Division 24, where it talks about the evaluation of lands for inclusion in the UGB. And I guess I would also say, please check. And I that there's not inconsistencies. And I wonder if there's any value in because you're sort of expanding on the priority system here in the urban reserve, which is now different than the priority system if you don't have an urban reserve. And I just wonder if there's any value in syncing those up. But also, the Division 24 very specifically says that all urban reserves, exception lands, and non-resource lands are equal in the first priority, whereas in here, your proposal is actually creating a situation in the reserves where all lands are not equal in the reserves. You have to go through certain lands first. Not really a judgment about which way is the best, but I feel like that it's just worth making sure in the future that however you really want this to happen, you're also looking at Division 24 to make sure that there's not any inconsistencies and that there's as much consistency as possible.
All right, thank you. That is one reminder and clarification. When we spoke last year, and I can't remember which meeting it was, but I'm positive it was Division 24. We did share with you all that we will not be able to decide how it happens, but that I'm trying to remember which one. It might have been House Bill 2001. It might have been the subsequent House Bill 2889, I think. Regardless, bill from 2023, the OHNA bill, requires us to separate out urban reserves as the first hierarchy alone. So you're right, Martha, the rules are not in alignment with the statute. The statute changed in 2003 with, it might have been House Bill 2001, and this rulemaking is to bring the rules in alignment with that statute. So we don't get to choose, but there was a legislative bill that tells us now we need to separate that out in rules. So thank you for mentioning that.
I understand that. I'm talking about actually the rules in 660 Division 24 related to the priorities for expanding the urban growth boundary. I know we're not changing statute here. So
yeah, the priorities, yeah. Reserves will become a first priority all by themselves. And I think there probably are other areas we can look at the prioritization hierarchy in 24 and what we're proposing in 21 and how we flesh those two out. So yeah, we'll get to the language in 24.
Okay.
just a reminder that the hierarchy in 24 is not yet updated to statute, just because it's a recent statute for this rulemaking. All right, so let's see, where am I? Okay, so the ability for non-metro cities to do rural reserves. I am not going to treat that as a clarifying question. So what I will do is I will flag that and we will come back to it in discussion. Let's see what else we've got here. Oh, how do I get rid of that?
Karen, this is Samantha Bear at the Oregon Home Builders Association. I had a quick question, and I'm sorry, I'm joining by the phone, so I can't tell who was just speaking. But I think something that I've been interested in, I'm hoping to get some clarity on, is looking at the rules itself. It does embed a different, like a priority, levels of priority that aren't there now for how a city should consider which land should be put into urban reserves. And I'm wondering, is it the department's impression that HB 2889 directed them to do that, or 2001 directed them to do that?
Not necessarily, but I'm going to table your question and we'll talk about that in a discussion. Is that all right?
Yep.
Thank you. I will get to that. Let's see, what do we have next? Funding. I think that is a great request. So we will check that one off. It's not a clarifying question. It's more of a suggestion, recommendation, and request. So we will move that one along. At once degrees, like trying to give expansion also doesn't have to be conducted entirely. So you pick as much or little. So this is requesting clarifying language in the bill that when a city is looking at expansion in the UGB analysis, it does not have to be conducted to the entirety of the URA. Rather, city can pick as much or as little of the URA to analyze based on the needed land for that expansion. And I think, Kevin, as I'm reading this, it shouldn't matter. So I'm going to treat this one as clarifying. If a city has a certain land need, let's say 100 acres, and they have 500 acres of urban reserve area, they can look within that urban reserve area and satisfy that acreage. They don't have to look beyond. The rules that we're proposing would give some hierarchy to, hey, look at that lower capability or that lower productive land first. But otherwise, a city can look around their urban reserve area and just consider the amount of acreage that they need to satisfy the land need. Is that correct?
Well, I think this is saying if I have 500 acres of urban reserve and there's an area I want to go into, and I know that, I can just pick that 100 acres and take it without further analysis. I think, and I'll have to look for this in the current rule. I think the current rules provide the EC analysis, the goal 14 balancing factors in that analysis of candidate urban reserve areas. So there is a fair bit of local discretion in that balancing, but that is an analysis that is required to look at the optimal lands within established urban reserves for actually, bringing into the UGB, as I understand it.
Yeah, the goal 14, I think it was section 30, subsection 2.
Thank you.
To look at your goal 14 locational factors.
Yep.
Colin, we're getting hands raised again. I don't know. Would you like to just work through the notes and then we'll go back to raised hands? How do you want to proceed?
Yeah, let's see. How many? I see one hand.
Two
Al,
right now.
is this with the selection of land within a URA?
Yep, mine's real quick. I just wanted to agree with Kevin that as I read the McMinnville cases and the cases that follow that, within a priority, say you're all urban reserve land and you got a certain amount of acreage, you use the goal 14 balancing factors that are left over in the McMinnville analysis for that. So you would have to look at the entire 500 acres and look at different ESE consequences and compatibility. That's the way I read it anyway.
Okay, that's the only hand. We're good now.
All right. Let's see. All right, Al, I'm actually going to ask that this one, we're given a bit more time on this one, so I'm not going to answer yours here probably today, but we're going to go back with our farm specialist, our agricultural land specialist, chat with some folks in the department and kind of work through this question, Al. So thank you for bringing that to us. But I'm going to flag that one for responding to at a later time. And then I thought this one was really interesting. So I mentioned that in the draft rules that you all looked at, there's a provision to differentiate. So there's an amendment to rule to differentiate more developable land based on, is there planned unit development or is there subdivision? And somebody asks here, does it matter if it's developed or not? Senate Bill 1129 doesn't really provide that clarity, so we would have to interpret the intent of the bill. I looked at the sticky note and then I read the bill a couple other times, and I think off the cuff, I would say it probably doesn't matter if I read the bill to a T, the language behind the bill. But I can't for certain say. I can't quite opine on what the intent of that bill was. So I'm going to check this one off as I hear your question. It is a clarifying question, and I may not know the answer today, but we'll work on an answer. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question, and to me it calls into to our attention. There is a pretty significant difference between in Division 24. There's a couple of places in the rules that allow cities to exclude lands from consideration for UGB expansion. There is a much narrower set of rules in our current urban reserve standards that talks about really land in just a couple of categories about, future urban services could not reasonably be provided, maximum efficiency of land uses. So there is no BLI. Cities don't do buildable land inventories for urban reserve areas, or, generally there's no requirement to do that. And so, there's some level of analysis that can be done for those candidate areas, but it's a question for the group as to whether it would make sense to, factor in development. It's treated differently in UGBs between residential lands for residential uses and lands for employment uses. Maybe that's getting too far down into the weeds, but I do think it highlights a question or a difference in between UGBs and urban reserve areas.
And Damien, I'm going to cut in front of you and just say, whoever wrote this, and it's not even to do a single person of whoever might have wrote this, it's actually to the entire group. I'm hoping that folks might be okay if they let us sit with this question for a little bit, and we'll come back with a version 2 proposal, and let's talk through it with version 2, just so today we can kind of get through version 1. But Damien, you had a thought on this clarifying question that we're not clarifying today very well.
Thanks, Cotton. So on the blue note that you've checked, I'm trying to think how to potentially answer the question, or maybe just kind of clarify. I think, if you're dealing with an area that's designated rural residential exception area, but it's developed with a subdivision, an actual plat that has houses, outbuildings, barns, that makes a difference in terms of how you look at an area versus another area that's not subdivided, maybe less developed in terms of thinking how this might be incorporated in our urban growth boundary, not just for housing, but maybe for multiple uses, housing, employment, maybe some other public uses.
Okay. Yeah, so developed based on uses. And then we also, I think, Damien, this is related, but I think there's a good recommendation down here in green that is related to that around subdivisions that are recorded and have that recording for the plat versus subdivisions that aren't. And so there's an additional statute and recommendation for rules here. I think we'll go back and spend some time with that and expect something for version 2 related to that. Mary Kyle, did you have something around either the planned development subdivisions or the platted and recorded subdivision?
Well, on this issue, and I agree with the distinction that I hope I understood. If I understood Damien, then I agree with the distinction he made about, but on this overall issue, the testimony that brought this bill forward and now signed into law was the concern about already developed particular named already developed subdivisions on the outskirts of Bend, but those exist in other places, not ones that were merely lines on a map. And because urban reserves are for a time period potentially very long after the existing urban growth boundary that might or might not be expanded into, development intentions can change, people can go bankrupt, and all of that can change. So to me, just because things are there's lines on a subdivision plat or anything like that doesn't, to me, say it should be treated any differently than a large vacant piece of land. I understand if lands are already developed, or if they are a rural residential exception area, that means it's already been found through the exceptions process to be impracticable because of development patterns or commitments development patterns. It's been practical for farm or forest use. But again, there can still be some pretty big pieces of land that are not developed in the midst of a rural residential subdivision. But in any event, I would have a lot of problems if this meant simply pieces of paper with lines on them are going to prevent those from being considered before that. Those areas could potentially be considered after more valuable farm and forest land.
So Mary Kyle, what I'm hearing is on the record, we might have testimony that
clarifies.
Our legal counsel could deduct legislative intent.
Right. Oral and written presented
So
testimony.
It sounds to me like the little blue sticky note, we need to go back to oral and written records.
Right. It's good clarifying questions.
Yeah. It's a great clarifying question. Okay. And with clarifying questions, I'm hoping we are not going to get into discussion now. Steve, what do you think? I'm ready to go to the next note.
I was just going to ask you, either we're going to have the discussion now or we're going to work our way through the notes, have the poll, and then have the discussion. So it's up.
So, hey, like I said, we'll see if I make it 8 seconds without getting bucked off. But we're going rodeo. First rodeo, y'all.
Yeah, why don't we hold our questions till after you get through the notes, and then we'll take clarifying
So
hands.
I see that there's a lot of discussion around the subdivision and whether it's planned or not, and we're going to save that for later. And we're going to move on to our next one. Brock, I'm going to give you like 3 seconds. I mean it. That's it.
Yeah, considering that we just have like 30 minutes left before we start wrapping things up, I think there's a lot of us that want to discuss the rules that were presented to us, and I would appreciate if we could maybe get some written responses to what's currently on the Miro board before the meeting next week. But if we could move into discussion, because I think we have a lot of important content that we need to get to. And I do appreciate going through and answering the questions, but just given time constraints, I think we should probably move forward.
And Steve, what do we have? Do we have about 40 minutes left?
We have 50 minutes left. We're not quite as far in the meeting as you are portraying there, Brock. So we have some time if there's some key questions that you want to go through, Kevin.
Steve, what do you think if we do a hard stop? Give me that 30-minute warning. Because I think a lot of this discussion, well, a lot of this is based on the rules. So
why don't you take up to 10 more minutes for questions, and then we'll move.
Okay. And some of these you guys will notice I flagged, and we'll kind of move on. We won't be addressing all of them. And this one here, is another clarifying question that our interpretation is that there's a slight difference between 3 and 4, and adding F in 3 was to comply with the way Senate Bill 1129 was written, to add a prioritization, but not necessarily to eliminate or rule out land, but that it would just be prioritized lower, while section 4 can kind of serves to rule out land. So that's what I'm gonna check that one off, and we're not going to do much more clarifying on that one, but we'll come back with written response to several of these. Clarify that urban using the critical services of water, wastewater. So critical service areas, this is a recommendation, not necessarily a clarifying question, but I think it was a really good recommendation. So author of that and the broader group, look for that in version 2. We'll see what we can do with that. If we can, we will, and if we can't, you'll see in writing why or why not we weren't able to bring that in there. I'm hoping in my presentation, this one got answered. If the author of this one could just give me a thumbs up that I answered this in the presentation with my slides. And if not, if you need something more, let us know what you need more in the chat and we'll get to it in discussion. So I tried to address this one in my slides in the presentation. All right, let's see where we're at. This also was good clarification. There's actually no definition in any of the goals. I checked all the goals, but there is a definition in statute. So we can make that correction and refer to statute instead of the goals. I think one goal references high value crop area, but none of the goals have a definition within it. Those are in statute. So we can clean up that rule language. This one is just what I said that, let's see, why was F added in front of loading rulemaking part 3 of AI? I think that's the one that we just addressed, that section 3 is that prioritization, while section 4 is about eliminating consideration versus prioritizing it. And so we'll make sure in any version 2 we come back with that refinement or that clarity. And then this is not a clarifying question, but it's a great discussion question. So I think we'll flag that for discussion because I think that's what folks want to talk about. So let's see, where are we? We are cruising through now. More documentation and guidance on where to find resources, difficult to find reputable sources. This is an interesting question. Can you imply the entire classification, so that soil classification system, to prioritize your lower capability land to your very highly productive land? Do you apply that to the entire tax lot? That's not clear to me either. I am going to check this one, but I will let you know that this is another one. We've got a few of them that we're going to go back to our farm and forest specialists. We're going to huddle internally, dig really deep into some of the statutes and get back to you all on that one. Kevin, you already know that if there is one that you know how to answer, by all means do so. Otherwise, I'm skipping them over and saying we've got specialists that we'll consult with. But Kevin, you chime in if you need to. Yes, this is a great recommendation. We'll bring that forward. So you'll see that in our discussion memo. You should see a response to that in writing when we come back with version 2. Let's see. Here's some recommendations for language. So we'll take those recommendations for version 2. Hey, you all, anytime you have grammatical recommendations for me, I have told Steve many a time, I am very, very proud of my English skills, but it is a second language for me. So we will gladly take those. And we got lots of internal folks looking at how those are written. So thanks for that recommendation. I addressed this a little bit in my presentation. I didn't address rewording it or the language. but I certainly will go back to it and really think about how we're describing the different prioritization within the agricultural lands, within those working farmlands. If you guys note, the statutes and the rules have less classifications for forest lands. So you'll see that reflected. All right, a few more here. Let's see how we're doing. How does the addition of tree reduce analytical burden? That's a good discussion question, so we'll flag that for discussion. There's not much clarifying there. This is a language clarity. I will go back with all language clarity for version 2. Kevin, I'd like to talk about this one. And it's okay that we don't have an answer. But let's say that we bring this back to discussion for the group, and it doesn't have to be today's discussion. If you already have an established urban reserve area, should you have to go back and map those that have prime and unique soils? Or should it be retroactive, or should it just be forward? The rule doesn't specify. The rule does not say that a city has to go retroactively and go map which ones have prime and unique soils. So that is a great discussion question for us to chat through. I don't think staff have landed one way or the other, but we're open to discussing that with the TAC and seeing where we land on that one. Let's see what else we have here.
Probably about 1 more minute, Kevin.
All right. Ray, last year, run and give that they would have. Why is a requirement being added? Let's do that one for discussion. Let's see, related to both 30 and 60, we have some small islands, class 2. Oh, I didn't want to get to this one. Let's see, I made notes on this one. Small islands of that prime soil, that high value farmland. There are rules existing that allow for that, and we did not change those rules. So small islands of class 1 and 2 soils in urban reserve areas, 4B is where it allows for this. Also in Division 24, Section 67, A and B, 1A and B allow for this as well. We're not changing those statutes. So if you've got tiny pockets that you need to bring in that other lower classification and those islands are completely surrounded, you retain the ability to do that, and no amendments to that. All right, let's see what I left out and we'll wrap up here. I think we left only a few. This one's good for, I think the rest are good for discussion. I have this for discussion. Let's do these with discussion. All right, Steve, so I think if there's a clarifying question that did not get answered or a new clarifying question that come up, let us know. And then Steve will let you transition, folks.
Yeah, Kat, and I think we should just move to the poll because all of our clarifying questions turn into discussion. So I don't know. I'll leave it up to you if you, well, maybe you'll need to stop sharing your screen so Ingrid can pull up our poll. I think we have a feeling how this one's going to go. But Ingrid, could you pull up the poll, please?
Sorry, I didn't know there was a poll this time. So
Ah,
I'm not sure if I have it ready.
okay. In that case, all the folks who had their hands raised before when we said we were going to pause on taking questions, let's go ahead and jump into our discussion. So Brock, go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things that I kind of want to flesh out here is how far along we think we are in compliance and with the implementation of Senate Bill 1129. Because as I see it, we took one line that was more or less in the bill and just plugged it in at the end of the prioritization rule subsection there. And the other one was actually in subsection 4 and with some slight rewording maybe was just moved up into 3. Does staff believe that this fulfills the intent of Senate Bill 1129, in the way that the rules are currently drafted? And I do have a follow-up.
Yeah, our understanding is the bill had two components to it. One was to differentiate only within exception and non-resource lands to create a tiered system there. So think of it as first tier A and B, 1A, 1B, sort of that tiering. And then the second part of the bill was to create an opportunity to lower the prioritization based on unreasonable cost due to physical constraints, being able to provide urban services. And so that was within the entire, yes, that is our understanding of the bill.
Okay, so then in the context of the comment, I think Mary Kyle made it earlier that part of the intent of this was to specifically address an issue for Bend. I want to make note that neither the definition of subdivision in 92-01017 or the definition of subdivision in 660 Division 4 Rule 48E, neither of those would apply to Bend's situation because the first one, that statute was created after the subdivision already existed. And the second one applies to strictly subdivisions of 10 units or less, all with, I believe, at least 1 acre lots for that. So, and Damien, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, neither of those would address the issue that the bill was trying to address for the city of Bend, correct?
Go ahead, Damien. Thanks, Brock.
Thank you. So regarding 660-04-00408E, that rule applies to planned unit developments that were created after 2000 when that rule came into effect. So that would not help us clarify or prioritize lands that were created before that time. And I think in particular, we're looking at subdivisions and planned developments that were created really before Deschutes County had zoning in place. That was one of the reasons for my recommendation of adding the addition of subdivision plat to 00303AI, because if you have a plat, you have something that actually describes a development. And if it's a planned development, it would include lots, open spaces, and either rights of way or roads that were described as tracts, for example.
Thank you, Damien. And so one more point, and then I'll pass it off to somebody else. The kind of questions around how does this help cities with reducing analytical burden and increasing legal certainty, and especially that 2001, how it helps smaller cities do this. Those were questions that I had added to the board, and do want to discuss those because it seems that what we have done is taken 1129, changed a few words from the bill itself and relocated some things that were already within Rule 30 here. And everything beyond that seems to be taking us backwards in terms of all three of those goals. This is not reducing analytical burden, having to go lot by lot, soil type by soil type, and not even knowing whether or not a partial lot is going to be excluded is unbelievable to me. Having to go through all of this, that is so much more time and analysis than most cities are willing to do, much less small cities. So I do not think that's been addressed. Additionally, there is nothing in here that prevents litigation based on following this, at least in this portion of the rule here. And so adding these extra layers of you got to look at this and then this and then this is just opening up cities to legal challenges as well. And certainly neither of these are going to help small cities. So I certainly hope that this was oversight.
Thanks, Brock.
Yeah.
I'll just take these in order. Go ahead, Martha. Unless Karen, did you have something you wanted to? Okay, go ahead, Martha.
Really noted.
Gosh, I have a lot of comments. So the first one about the subdivisions and the plan development, I guess we'll stay on that theme. That made me a little nervous. I think that what is written in here is very, very broad. And I think, and that it may, and I don't know to the extent that we're allowed to put additional parameters on it. I think it really, in my mind, has more to do with lot sizes. You could have a subdivision in the county, in the rural area outside of a city that has 5 or 10 acre lots. And so why would you exclude those? but this allows you to. I really think it has more to do with lot sizes. Like planned unit developments allow smaller lot sizes and then they have open space, which is not developable. That's like an open space tract. And so maybe a planned unit development would make sense. But again, I feel like it gets down to lot sizes. I don't think it matters necessarily whether or not it's a platted subdivision, because we have subdivisions in the county that are old that weren't necessarily platted, but they have like half-acre lots out there. Like to me, it'd be reasonable to exclude those, but not the platted subdivision lots with the 5 acres. And so that's kind of where my mind was going, is I'm wondering if we can put some parameters around excluding these areas, but based on, to some extent, based on lot sizes. The second thing is in there, it says land with the first priority category may be given lower priority. And that to me says you could give it a priority 5. Like I think more clarity needs to be put in there about what you do with these. And maybe that's the intent. I don't know. But I don't think it is. And so I think there needs to be more clarity about what you mean by giving it a lower priority. It's like, I think I heard you say it's tiered within the first priority lands, but that's not how it reads to me. And then the same thing with adding the F with the urban services, not reasonable or cost effective due to topographical or other physical constraints is really broad. That leaves a lot of wiggle room. And maybe given a lower priority. Again, it doesn't say like, are they all now priority 5? So like same type of comments. And then I was thinking maybe I could add, just if you give me one more minute or two, a little bit of clarity on the language about high value farmland, because I do work for Clackamas County. We deal with this all the time. And so part of the distinction between the two references is which soil types you can include in your definition of high value farmland. But when high value farmland is defined, you look at a lot and you look at the predominant soils. And so it does add a little bit of analytical burden to it, but it wouldn't necessarily be splitting properties. It's not simply based on sort of the mapped like geography of the soils. The reference to 210 ORS, I'm sorry, ORS 215 710 sub 1 is actually a reference specifically to prime unique class 1 or class 2 soils. Those are considered the best farmland soils. And so I think there is a reference to it in here, but it's not consistently referenced. So if you look at sub E, it allows you to add in predominantly comprised of prime and unique soils, but what about our class 1 and 2? They're not necessarily prime or unique. I think it really should just, if you're talking about those, like in D, it talks about may not include those listed in 215, 710, 1, but then E should add those, all of those back in. And so the distinction is you've got the what we call low value, non-high value soils. Then there's high value soils that may not be prime unique class 1 or 2. And then there's the high value soils that are prime unique class 1 and 2. And I think those are the 3 categories that you're trying to hit here in the priority system. And I think that maybe it just needs a little bit of tweaking to make sure that everything's included and it's referenced consistently. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thanks, Martha. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'll stop there. I'll let someone else talk.
Damien.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I had a couple additional thoughts about your proposed language under 0030 AI. I did appreciate Martha's comments about lot sizes, because the examples that we are thinking of when looking at that language are platted subdivisions where the lots are, I'm going to guess, 3 acres or less in size. If you do look at, as an example, some of the tax lot maps around Bend, you may see like a row of uniform lots that are like 5 or 10 acres in size. Those are likely not created in a subdivision. So they may be, for example, things we would look at for potential urban reserve. I did want to go back to the proposed, let's see, E regarding urban services. I put a comment on the mirror board that this is a good starting point in terms of covering those urban services that we need to address with urbanization. For urban reserves, I think the more critical make or break services are going to be those like water, wastewater collection, and transportation. And when I say transportation, I mean, roads, streets, and mass transit. I did want to note that in this context, it may seem obvious, but I want to state it anyway. Water in this context means domestic water. So either water provided by a city water utility or a water district. It does not include water provided by an irrigation district. They're organized under a different statute, and they provide water for agriculture and ranching. And just wanted to wrap up briefly, so I know other people wanted to weigh in. If you need examples, I am happy to send along some either tax lot maps or copies of surveys of some of the things that we're talking about regarding existing subdivisions that were platted before Deschutes County really had any zoning, or when they had some interim zoning before they had an acknowledged zoning code in compliance with the comp plan.
Great. Thank you, Damien. Really appreciate that. Alexandra.
Hi, just really kind of wanted to put a finer point on kind of what Brock and to some extent Damien have brought up, and kind of the overlap between this and 1129. I think really, as far as these rules that we have in front of us, I don't know that they entirely align with kind of the intent of 1129. And I think that creates potentially some problematic things down the road in the future as we look towards implementation fully of 1129. I think looking at kind of what was provided for the record, both by City of Bend and the sponsor and Representative Mannix, this really has not kind of threaded the needle as far as that is concerned, in terms of making it easier for cities to develop urban reserves and making those urban reserves less prone to legal challenge. Because I think when we talk about cities developing urban reserves and why we don't see a lot of cities go through that process, those really are kind of those primary reasons. And so I think, as far as, I am not the technical expert here. But I think as far as the legislative intent on that goes, I think, there are substantial portions of this that give me great pause.
Okay, thank you. Mary Kyle.
Just two things. I'll start with the easier one first. On 1129 and incorporating it, I'm still confused as to why you proposed putting the portion of it that deals with cost, things are not land is not reasonable or cost effective due to topographical or physical constraints. I don't understand why that's in subsection, or proposed to be in subsection 3 of this section of the rule, as opposed to subsection 4, which already addresses this topic area with maybe one additional phrase from the legislation about cost effectiveness. But it already deals with bumping up the priority scheme based on topographical or other physical constraints. I just think it doesn't seem to fit in 3 to me, and I think it fits in 4. And if it's in 3 and not in 4, then what does 4 mean anymore going forward? So I'm not suggesting solving that now, but I don't understand that, because I think the intent of the bill for this part and 4 are how you can go a bump up lower priority land to a higher priority. On this morass of a subject regarding the first priority, I'll just say this is a really great example of why one city, or it could be a county or something's problem translated into statewide legislation is really problematic. And so we're all trying to make something fit the state that was coming from a particular problem in Bend. And I'm not trying to blame Damien for this, because that's not what I mean at all. But in any event, it is, as I understand from being really involved in following and participating in this legislation, is that it is about tiering within the first priority. It's not about making other priorities or permutations. Or except within the first priority, tiering within the first priority. And the example given throughout from the city of Bend was Deschutes River Woods, an already developed residential development. I'm not a planner, whether it's however it was created and when it was created and what its technical planning name is, subdivision, planned unit development, et cetera. I don't know, but it was Deschutes River Woods, a particular already developed area that the city wanted the flexibility within the first tier to bring in non-resource lands and other areas that did not have houses already on them that were in that first tier. I think there's already that flexibility in the urban reserve rule, but that was clarity that was needed by the city. So it is not designed to allow a city to skip over such lands forever because they are still within that first priority in an urban reserve. But they could be skipped over for a while going to lands that don't have houses on them. And so in any event, I am concerned about, you've talked about, some of you, plats that have been there since before counties had land use zoning. Are those now going, even if they have no development on them, will the result of this be that they can be skipped over for a while to go to other kinds of lands still within that first priority? That doesn't seem to make sense to me. So I don't know how to write this, but all I know is that it was about residential development that was at a density already in a development that would make it politically and or practically difficult to urbanize further.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. I want to just pause there for a second, Colin, to see if you have any thoughts or reactions to what we've heard so far. Also, I want to encourage folks maybe who haven't chimed in yet to get in the queue so we can hear, make sure we're hearing from everyone. Colin, anything you want to respond to now, or do you want to proceed with the questions and comments?
Yeah, no, I think some of it we answered in clarifying questions, but I do hear the finer point, Mary Kyle, around both the legislative intent and some of the testimony on record, but also that tiering system within one. I think I shared how we interpreted the bill, and I know it could be interpreted a different way, but that 3I, as we read the bill, it really asked for the ability to tier within that first category, and we've written it that way. But if others, for some reason, interpret the bill differently, let us know. I would like to go back to some of the general comments around this is not in compliance with 1129. This is not in compliance with reducing analytical burden. I will say we are balancing House Bill 2001 and this efficient urbanization to meet a very large housing need, and balancing the facilitation of lower priority to lands that are deemed more difficult to develop. And rightfully so. I think they do present less capacity when you bring in something like Deschutes River Woods into a UGB. It doesn't present a whole lot of development capacity in many cases. And I think we're balancing those things with that first slide that I shared, that really asks us, it requires city to look at all lands around them and choose those with the least impact and the least effect to the agricultural, forest, or timber, these resource production lands around them. And it asks you to look at the compatibility of your urban uses with those adjacent agriculture and timber forestry activities. And so I will say that not everything, and I think to Sam Bear's original question, Sam, if you're still with us, you might be traveling in the car. we had to take both what we got from Senate Bill 1129, what we got from House Bill 2001, and you all found typos in the existing rules. We too, as a department, we found areas of the rules needed clarification. And we were able to add that clarification in. If you agree with the clarification or not, we did try to reference statute and say, this is where we're getting our directive from, Goal 14, or a specific statute. I think I had 197A, I forget now, 232. And I understand there's a variety of perspectives by all means, but I wanted to put that on the table out there, just so you all knew that we did not just try to come out of left field and be like, hey, we're gonna do our own thing, despite these legislative bills, or despite our Goal 14 hierarchy. By no means we were intending to do that, but certainly there are different ways of looking at it. So, Steve, I have no idea who's next.
If
No,
I could
I
just
got-
add, if
Oh,
I could
go
just
ahead.
add one more thing, another thing that came up as a reason that a city might need to bring one of these subdivisions in, and whether it's Deschutes, Riverwoods, or any subdivision around any city, is you can find failing septic systems and wells and other potential health hazards that or things like that relating to infrastructure that would drive a city to want to take that in and deal with it. Thanks.
Thanks. Let's go to Al.
Thank you. Just a couple, a thought just to put out there is that it may be that we should be looking at some of the issues that have been raised here as bearing on the question of yield rather than the question of exclusion or putting in or out of a tier. If you have to include things in an urban reserve or an urban growth boundary that don't have a realistic yield or have major constraints on the prospect of their being developed because they're golf courses or CCNRs or whatever it is, that should have a bearing on yield. And so if there are people who think that there's a presumption that about yield for urban reserves that's different from the presumption for lands in the urban growth boundary expansion process, I'd like to know more about that. That's all I have.
Go ahead, Brock.
Yeah. One thing of note, first, I do absolutely think that Senate Bill 1129 intended to be able to skip over A, right? If you have an area that is developed and is not likely to redevelop in the near future, but you still need to do your urban reserve planning, it makes sense to skip over an area where, there's not going to really be that much development and go to marginal land next. I think that is fairly intuitive. Additionally, I would note that adding an existing subdivision to an urban reserve does not connect it to sewer. It would need to be annexed in by the city or the local district that provides that. So I disagree with the assertion there that's a reason. Additionally, looking at rules 60 and 70. 60, I'm not really sure why this is needed there. 70, I think this is actually harmful and even to agricultural land, right? Let's say that 75% of or 25% of your urban reserve is farmland, and you have to absorb 80% of that into your UGB before you can expand the urban reserve potentially onto non-farmland. Now you're eating up farmland. So I don't really understand the purpose of either of those two additions. Yeah, I'll stop there.
All right, Martha, and then Damien. Oh.
Thanks. I just wanted to reiterate what Mary Kyle said about where this ability to change the priority for constrained lands or lands that are hard to provide urban services for belongs. I hadn't really looked at number 4 until she said that. And it does allow for it, but I think the big distinction is the wording in the Senate bill is to allow higher priority land to be moved down because it can't be served, versus number 4 right now says lower priority land can be moved up. And so I feel like there's a way to sort of like work it into 4. rather than adding it separate, because if you add that, then 4 does sort of become confusing and maybe just even not necessary. So I feel like I am just agreeing that I think maybe it belongs in 4, and maybe it's just sort of re-looking at it like from up down rather than down up in terms of prioritization. I also just really want to reiterate, I really think the developed subdivision or whatever it is has a lot to do with lot sizes. And if we can add that in there, I would highly encourage that, because I can tell you that we do have subdivisions in Clackamas County with 5-acre lots. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to bring into an urban growth boundary. And I think there are reasons to bring subdivisions in sometimes. But that's okay, because this allows but doesn't require a jurisdiction to give a lower priority to these sort of developed divided lands. And so I think if there is a reason to bring a subdivision in, it wouldn't cause a problem. And then my last comment, and I'm gonna have to hop off here in a second, has to do with this under 60, the addition of number 2 and adding in a prioritization inside an area that you've already created through a prioritization. And again, I'm a little hesitant to make a city do that analysis all over again. And the whole point of having an urban reserve is you're identifying land to pull in first, right? And so I have sort of mixed feelings about that addition. And I see Ted Reed putting his thumb up, because I'm curious if we would have to do this inside of Metro, right? I mean, Metro urban reserves are under a different rule, but maybe we would have to do that. So anyway, I'm not sure it's necessary, because why would you ever do an urban reserve if you weren't creating sort of an easier system of including land inside of your urban growth boundary? So that's it. And unfortunately, I have to take off. So it's good to see everyone. I'll stop talking now again.
Thanks, Martha. I did see a lot of nodding heads there. Karen, do you want to chime in there? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna address both 60 and 70, just because various folks had brought it up and we saw it on the mirror board as well. I think what the department found, and it was also brought to our attention from interested parties. So you all know we've been doing a lot of public involvement, community engagement around this, and other folks have brought this up to the department, that the hierarchy one needed a lot more refinement. It was broad and vague in nature, and it needed a bit more alignment with statutes. But also, as you bring in land into a reserve, it then loses all of that underlying information about whether it's high capability or highly productive land or lower capability. And so I think where the thinking around the rules, and I'm not saying it was right or wrong, it was put forth for you all to consider, but where the thinking lies is around the thought that if you have lands in a reserve, you have a certain 50-year land need, and you have some marginal land, some non-resource land, maybe some exception, and that didn't satisfy the land need. So you've also got some farmland, and then maybe you have some higher value, some of that very high capable soil classifications, that it didn't make sense that all those are sitting into a reserve, and when you go to expand your UGB, that you would leave some of the higher priority lands sitting there and go after the lower priority that are those high capability or high value lands and the high classification soils. It didn't make sense that all of a sudden you grab farmland in lieu of marginal or non-resource land. And so that lack of hierarchy of how that happens is why you're seeing the prioritization, and why when you go to expand your urban growth boundary, what's in your reserve matters, and that underlying information of that soil classification or that land productivity for timber or for agricultural products, it matters. It's not just all of a sudden it's reserve and it doesn't matter what classification it was before it came into reserve. And I know that it can be argued 5 different ways, probably a dozen different ways. And then in under 70, this threshold of, and I think it really is to Al's point. We had a lot of conversations last year about yield And we all talked about good urban form. Why skip over something like Deschutes Riverwood instead of bringing it in to have a contiguous urban form and assuming low capacity? I don't believe we're going to get much more out of Deschutes. I'm not picking on Central Oregon, but take your subdivision. Martha said there were plenty of subdivisions in her county. To bring those in for that continuity of land that's been urbanized and is now in residential use. And I think we are definitely looking for ways to demonstrate that there's a lower capacity or lower yield, but that those lands will come into a reserve. And so that threshold of, have you not incorporated isn't the word, but have you urbanized this urbanizable land from a reserve to a UGB? Have you done that sufficiently before you go out and start expanding more? And I think, Brock, what typically happens is those exception lands and the non-resource lands may sit there, and the agricultural land gets urbanized, and then the URA, the urban reserve area, is expanded and more agricultural land is brought in. That's what we're trying to mitigate for. So just some rationale. I'm not saying that the rationale is right or wrong. It's just questions came up of where is staff coming from with this? Where did you get your legislative authority to do this? And so I hope at the top of the meeting, you're seeing how we're looking at statutes and where the rules needed more clarity to align with statutes. And we're just putting that on the table for consideration in the landscape of Senate Bill 1129 and House Bill 2001. Y'all are making me drink a lot of water today.
Yeah, hang on to the Bronco there and the rodeo, because all right, we have 5 hands up. We're gonna take them in order. Let's try to keep them to about a minute apiece so we can wrap up and get everybody out on time. Damien, please start us.
Thanks, Steve. So going back to this topic of subdivisions for a second, when I'm looking at Senate Bill 1129 and the rules we're looking at, I'm looking at this through the lens of housing production. And that is a topic that will be affected by existing development patterns, lot sizes, topography, cost of infrastructure. And I want to gently push back against the notion that cities should be required to bring in and serve an existing subdivision to provide urban services, particularly if we're not going to get much yield out of it, and if we're going to get potentially some significant pushback from rural landowners that are living in areas outside of Bend for their own reasons. This came up during the 2010 UGB remand that we had with the state. I'm happy to go dig up the findings of the department and the commission if that might help inform this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Damien. Corey.
Yeah, hi, thanks everybody. So just wanted to share a little perspective on Senate Bill 1129. So this was a bill that we talked an awful lot about with the city of Bend, with Senator Broadman, who was the sponsor of the bill. And just want to affirm our understanding is really as it's been described by staff, which is that a portion of this bill, the 2 things it's intended to do, one of them is tiering within that first priority bucket. So I think that's pretty clearly on the record. We go back and reference that and cite those and direct staff to them. But those were, the nature of the conversations that we were having and our understanding of intent with that bill. I think that another kind of piece of this puzzle that I just want to flag is the reasonable and cost-effective piece, right? So that's pretty broad. I think staff is proposing that this is another thing that's going to be sort of better defined in guidance. And I think for that one, just potentially in rules seems like it might be good to have a little more clarity, so that we're understanding that it's not, simply being more expensive isn't sufficient. So I think like some further clarity there might be a good idea. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Samantha.
Thank you. Yeah, Samantha with Oregon Home Builders. So I am just going to kind of zoom out for a second. I know we're in attack, and normally this is more focused on technical implementation, but I think this conversation deserves a higher level look at the underlying policy. And I'm just a little, just Karen, responding to what you said respectfully, I just don't, I get where DLCD staff is coming from, and it's very obvious where DLCD is coming from looking at the draft language. But I think where DLCD is coming from in this is not the right place, because it's looking at urban reserves as another goal 3 ag land preservation tool and not a goal 10 housing production oriented tool, which was the actual point of HB 2001 and 1129. It wasn't supposed to do and rewrite the urban reserve tools to, again, add more and more layers of analysis related to preserving agricultural land. And the way that the rules look now, there's absolutely zero incentive for any city to go through the urban reserves process. And what we've talked about so intensely in the housing production space in the last couple of years is trying to encourage more cities to do urban reserve, so that you kind of get out of the way, your conversations on the fact that, hey, community, yeah, we're going to likely have to expand into farmland. That's just the reality of where we're at in terms of how, land is zoned outside of our UGBs. But this land is going to be for housing in the future. And it's supposed to be a housing focused tool, not a farmland preservation focused tool. That's what rural reserves are for. And so I just think, looking at this draft, I feel like we've missed the mark on that. And I would like to have, and we can potentially do that offline, a separate conversation to kind of look at how to actually make this a housing production focused tool, and one that cities actually have any sort of incentive to use.
Thanks, Brock, and then Al, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, and just to respond to one of the kind of clarifications of the department's thought pattern as far as bringing in certain parts of your urban reserve land before others. The reason that when there is farmland and a subdivision that get added to an urban reserve and then to a UGB, and the farmland develops first, is because it has capacity and because it can produce housing, and the existing developed area does not have much capacity. And so it does not make sense to bring in something where we know the capacity is going to be functionally zero, when the goal is to say, hey, this is land that we need for housing, which is why we're planning for it this far in advance. Let's bring in land that you can actually build housing on, instead of one where you have to tear down every property that's already there and redevelop everything in order to get it to work. That's part of the reason why we don't have enough housing now, is because the way that we have been prioritizing which lands we develop on is not working very well, right? We don't have land. Monmouth had 10 lots that were developable in its entire city, and they had to go to the legislature for it. And yes, Bend did have to go to the legislature to get this fixed for their urban reserve process. All of that is surrounding the one point of, clearly the system as it currently is in its current form is not working for cities to be able to develop housing. So I absolutely agree with Sam. This should be a much broader conversation, and we need to make sure that this tool is focused on creating housing as it was intended to, and not to advance goal 3.
Thanks, Brock. So I'm gonna ask folks to stay just 5 minutes after Al, please go, and then we just have a few things we want to talk about before we let you go. Thank you. You're on mute, Al. All right, Al, maybe you are passing on your.
No, okay, I got it. You got me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just saying, I'm not going to do the policy stuff, but at this point, but I simply say, I don't think it is the agency's fault, but based on the current status of the statutes, the court cases, and the rules as they stand now, as they're going, I can't imagine myself ever advising a client city or county to go through the urban reserve process until there's some legislative change. This is really very difficult for everybody, including you.
Thanks, Al. Okay. Let's move into our wrap-up phase here. I'm going to start with Karin, because we have a RAC meeting coming up on June 11th, and I think you have an ask, Karin?
Yeah, so you all are not gonna get off the hook this easy. You're not gonna walk away and then go off and consider weight conversion 2 or consider the rules. We're going to backtrack. We've had conversations last year and we had conversations last month about inventorying your buildable land and estimating capacity on that buildable land. And we talked about partially vacant, a capacity, land supply and market factor reduction. We talked about a safe harbor for land use efficiency measures. And so I'm looking for a couple of folks that are willing to zoom out real big and look at the balancing of what we want cities to do when we think about capacity and accurately assessing that capacity, the analysis that goes into getting as accurate as possible. We know it's not going to be completely accurate, but having some substantial ground or foundation to rely on that this is our buildable land and the capacity we can assume for that 20-year need. And also balancing that with, we don't necessarily want to overcount. We would like to reduce the existing paper capacity or phantom capacity that exists. And I think like today's conversation, there's a variety of perspectives, there's a spectrum, and I'm hoping a couple of you would volunteer to share for a few minutes your thoughts on the city's need to assess capacity and be very efficient with the use of their land and accurate in that assessment. And then also balancing that we know there's some paper or phantom capacity and how do we reduce and mitigate that. So if you think about the conversations we've had, if you look at the RAC packet that went out this morning, please contact me. If I don't get anybody volunteering, I might start calling y'all and figure out who's coming to RAC with me next week. So just wanted to leave y'all with that, think about that. And I would invite a couple folks to come join me and talk to the RAC on Wednesday. Thanks, Steve.
Yep. And just a reminder, our next meeting is on Tuesday, June 17th. So make sure you have that Tuesday, not Thursday, marked in your calendar for our next meeting. Thanks everyone for your participation today. Lots to think about, lots to ruminate on. And of course, we'll be coming back with another version down the road. But thanks for your extra time today. And we will see you on June 17th.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks, everybody.